Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Sam.
I'm Emma.
Three of Australia's major economic forces, the RBA, the ACCC and the federal government, are coming together to crack down on card surcharges. This week, the Albanese government said it was sending a message to payment providers like Visa, MasterCard and American Express that the days of unfair or excessive surcharges on credit and debit card payments by consumers, by us, were numbered. On today's podcast, we're going to explain how these charges currently work, why it's a problem, and what the government is suggesting that we do about it.
Okay, Sam, today we are talking about something that well and truly impacts each and every one of us, card surcharges.
I'd go as far as saying it impacts us all every day.
Yeah, truly. You know what I'm talking about if you've ever been at the checkout, you take your card out, you're about to pay for something and all of a sudden the price jumps up.
Just a bit. Just a couple of cents.
Yeah, well, a couple of cents depending where you are, maybe astronomically for reasons that you can't explain. So before we dive into what this all means, where it all comes from, let's start with what a surcharge actually is. Why do these little extra payments on top of our transactions exist?
Well, basically, it's an amount or a percentage that a business adds to the price of a product or a service. So you're buying your coffee, it's $4. You get to the checkout, it's $4.07. And that cost covers for the business, either partially or sometimes the entire cost, the fee that the business has to pay to their payment facilitator. And when we say payment facilitator, we're talking about the MasterCards, the Visas, the American Expresses, the people who provide them with the payment gateways to collect payment from us and then funnel it back into a bank account.
Got it. So we've got us, the consumer, the bank, the business, and the provider.
Exactly. And for a business to use Visa, let's say, to collect payments, Visa has to make money somehow. And so they make money on every transaction. Now, big businesses will cover that transaction because they kind of don't want to go through the routine at the checkout of you realizing there's a bit extra. So you go to, let's say, a department store or a big pharmacy chain, they'll actually just absorb that themselves. It's more the small businesses, say hospitality or small retail, that will add that on top. Now, the surcharge does vary based on if you've inserted your card, if you've tapped your card. It's generally more expensive to tap your card, and who the payment facilitator is. Now, I'm sure you might recognize from kind of shop windows that American Express is always a bit more expensive for businesses to accept. They often pass that on to a consumer, and consumers like using American Express because there's rewards programs and extra incentives. But according to a recent article from the RBA, you can expect to be charged an extra 0.2% on the average EFTPOS transaction, but an Amex fee will normally be about an average of 1.4%. So it can be quite a range.
And one thing that I've noticed more and more, especially with online purchasing, you might get to the checkout and you'll see, a whole range of payment options, whether that's PayPal, a buy now, pay later. And been surprised by the clarity of the specific surcharge amount. So you can really see that a couple of different options that might all kind of seem like they're coming from the same place or going to the same place, you can be charged between 0 point something to 2% on those different options. And I think consumers are starting to get more savvy on, okay, which payment option is going to screw me over the least here.
Definitely. And I think for the RBA and the ACCC, they are really closely regulating this space. So I think those examples online that you're talking about, that's probably not by the choice of the retailer. It's now a really important area of compliance. But before we go on, I just want to make one quick distinction because you just mentioned it. It's really important to remember the difference between a credit card and a debit card, and credit card fees and debit card fees. So a debit card is a card that gives you access straight to your bank. And the big thing we're talking about today are the fees attached to that. Credit card fees, when you're spending money that technically isn't yours and then you pay it back monthly or at an interval, those fees are kind of out of scope for this discussion.
Yeah. And we're talking as well about transaction fees. So the cost of buying something in the moment using an electronic payment method for that rather than a credit card fee that might be associated with just owning the credit card.
Exactly. And I think if you really boil it down and if you're feeling like you're getting a bit lost in all of this financial talk, The big question being asked by government is, should you be charged a fee to access money that's already yours?
So there is some regulation in this space that you've touched on a little bit. It's not just the Wild West, right?
Yeah, so the RBA sets the rules on surcharging. The ACCC enforces those rules. Merchants, as you see online and in real life, they are allowed to surcharge, but it's only up to what's called the cost of acceptance for that particular type of card. This kind of benchmark set for a Visa versus an Amex versus a MasterCard. It's a really complex system. Some different cards have different costs. Sometimes those differences are communicated to consumers in different ways. Sometimes they're a flat fee. Sometimes they're a percentage. I'll often see a cafe do a flat fee, and let's say that your flat fee is 50 cents for a transaction. They might say a minimum of $10 for an FPOS machine charge. You can go under that, but you have to pay 50 cents. If you're paying 50 cents on a $4 coffee, then you're paying an extra 12.5% on your coffee. So there's a lot of variability here. And I think that's kind of what the government wants to talk about.
Okay, so it's not illegal for businesses to impose these card surcharges, but basically what you're saying is excessive payment surcharges are not allowed. The surcharge has to kind of be justifiable within reason, that it's got to sort of reasonably cover the business's cost to run that transaction.
Exactly. But as we're using cash less and less. I mean, the latest stats is that about 13% of retail transactions are done by cash. The rest is all electronic payments. I think what's reasonable and what's not probably needs a little bit more exploring from the consumer perspective.
Because it doesn't really feel optional for the consumer. If, like you say, we're moving towards a cashless society, most young people are not walking around with a spare $20 in their pocket to pay for that coffee to avoid that 12.5% surcharge example. But despite it being a couple of cents here and there, I'm sure that adds up for the individual, for the economy. Do we know how much it adds up?
Well, the RBA estimates it's between $1 billion in surcharges, and some estimates are putting it up to as high as $4 billion. It's costing businesses, so the businesses that are absorbing those costs themselves, it's costing businesses $2 billion a year to make those payments to payment companies. So we're talking a lot of money here. I know it doesn't feel like a lot because it's in such tiny increments, but it really does add up.
It certainly does add up, and it's interesting you mentioned there the cost to businesses. I think us consumers can sometimes have a bit of a perspective that it's the businesses trying to rip us off rather than there being a whole chain of transactional stakeholders, I guess, from your visas to the businesses. So either way you cut it, the consumer or the business ends up paying for these fees to the payment providers just to make the purchases in their everyday life. And even though it is 5 cents here or there, it does add up. So you said this week that the government has made big announcements about how to regulate this space. What have they suggested?
Well, the government's come out strong this week about debit card transaction surcharges. They did allude to a closer look at credit card transaction surcharges, but the big focus here is on debit cards. And what they're proposing is to ban debit card surcharges entirely from the 1st of January 2026. They're going to wait for a review currently underway by the Reserve Bank before that legislation would be tabled. But the government does seem pretty keen to take steps before the review is delivered. So they've additionally committed $2.1 million to the ACCC to boost investigations into illegal and unfair surcharging. And they said they want to increase consumer education as well.
Yeah, that does seem like a big gap. Aside from the regulation space, actually telling consumers what their rights are, what is reasonable, what is excessive when it comes to those fees. The big move, though, is this potential ban on debit card surcharges from 2026. But considering that these fees impact all of us every day into the billions of dollars every year, why does it need to take that long?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because, we've got a federal election sometimes before May, and this kind of reform is traditionally pretty popular in Australia. We're going to make everything cheaper for you across the board. But the government knows they need to be careful with this, and that's why they're waiting for the Reserve Bank's advice, because it could have adverse effects on businesses. And they need to strike a balance between protecting consumers, but also making sure that the businesses have access to payment services. I mean, the last thing that you would want if you owned a small business is the payment provider saying, well, because we don't want to operate in this environment anymore, we're taking away our Visa service or our MasterCard service. The government also wants to make sure that it's not businesses who are copying the fees and penalties themselves. And whilst there might be a law that means that consumers can't be charged unless they do it in a proper kind of financial modeling kind of way, they wouldn't want the businesses to be taking that cost on.
And this really ties into an interesting conversation going on in the US at the moment, where the government is suing Visa, accusing it of this debit card monopoly. Because when we consider those costs, whether it's the consumer absorbing it or the business absorbing it, it's ultimately 2 or 3 key players who set the agenda for these transactions. And this case in the US from the Department of Justice has essentially said that Visa has kind of taken advantage of its market dominance to control, quote, the price of nearly everything. So that lawsuit is going to be a really interesting one to watch play out.
Well, the US is a really interesting space in this regard because they don't have federal law about credit card or debit card surcharges. There's these lawsuits that are popping up now more commonly, but it's state-based. And so what you find in the US is that you might be buying something from an online company that's based in another state and you have to kind of understand what their surcharges are. But this is being discussed all over the world. I mean, in the UK, they banned all surcharges on credit and debit card payments back in 2018. And that was part of this EU-wide initiative to end excessive card charges. The UK's ban actually went further than the current proposal by the Australian government because it covered both credit and debit cards.
Okay, interesting. That I remember being kind of controversial at the time in the UK. When we think about the business community back here in Australia, how have they reacted to this?
Well, it's a mixed bag. So small businesses have expressed those concerns I mentioned earlier that a potential surcharge ban might mean that they would have to absorb the costs themselves. There are other businesses that are saying this is a really positive move. It's about time the government stands up to, as you said before, these 2 or 3 major players in the payment space. It's been really interesting looking at some of the kind of corresponding developments from the really big retailers. So I read a report in the Australian Financial Review this week about Chemist Warehouse, and they're introducing this new system where they're putting up stickers of QR codes at the counter. You can scan it and kind of bank transfer Chemist Warehouse.
Really?
And that's their attempt to get around paying the credit card surcharges and debit card surcharges themselves. They say they're spending about $15 million a year on payment surcharges.
That is really interesting, the example of like a Chemist Warehouse kind of figuring out a workaround for customers. I also just heard about this other app that's called Ping that consumers can use at the checkout to kind of work around these charges. And I do feel like it's a space that's waiting for a little bit more disruption.
Definitely. And the payments giants know that themselves. And I mean, in response to all of this, they've come out globally and said things along the lines of, we're providing a really effective service to businesses big and small. We're ensuring that you can have clear reporting on how much money you're making. We are ensuring that it gets to your bank accounts fast. And just like any other business in the world, we need to make money by doing that. So there are many sides to this discussion, and I'm sure that they're not going to want to lose a major income stream as well. So they'll continue to kind of prove their case. But I think the consumer is going to be central to how the government plays this.
These changes proposed in Australia do seem fairly moderate. I think it's worth mentioning. We're not trying to completely reinvent the wheel. Some other more significant changes in overseas markets that you've touched on. So what's the response been like to the announcement here in Australia from a regulatory standpoint to start with? Have we heard from the ACCC?
Well, the ACCC has welcomed the announcement. They described excessive card surcharging as a key concern for consumers and small businesses. They acknowledged that while businesses aren't banned from charging a surcharge for card payments, consumer and competition legislation means that the charge must not be more than what it costs the business to use that payment. And they said if a business charges a card payment surcharge, it must be able to prove the costs it's based on. And I think that's probably a good starting point for all of these investigations and deeper dives to go from is, are businesses making a margin from these payments?
Yeah. And of course, Australian consumer law dictates that, businesses can't be misleading customers on their pricing tactics. This is a government announcement. It's all kind of hypothetical at the moment while we await that review. Have we heard anything from the opposition?
The opposition came out really strongly yesterday against the announcement. We got a statement from Susan Lee. She's the deputy leader of the opposition, and Angus Taylor, the shadow treasurer. They called the announcement, quote, another desperate attempt by the government to address a cost of living crisis that they say it has caused. And their core criticism of the announcement is that this is only a proposed change from 2026 and that it didn't provide short-term relief to Australians who are struggling financially.
So it's not that the coalition are necessarily saying they're against reform here. It's more that they think that this action doesn't go far enough, quick enough.
Well, it might surprise you, Emma, to hear that politicians are politicking, but I think the real the real discussion at the moment for the opposition is what's the government doing short term to help Australians in this cost of living and housing crisis. We've got an election, as I said, sometime before May. Economics and cost of living is going to be, I dare say, probably the key topic for a lot of voters.
So what happens from here then in the meantime?
So the Reserve Bank is set to release a consultation paper soon, and that's not the final report from the Reserve Bank. It's kind of a status update on how they're going. It might foreshadow how they're thinking about implementing changes, what potential impacts on consumers and businesses could look like. From there, though, we'll have to wait for that final report. Then we'll get proposed government legislation. Then it will be discussed in Parliament, and then we might see some change.
So don't hold your breath.
Don't hold your breath and keep tapping away.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for breaking all of that down for us, Sam. Really, really helpful. And as we mentioned, this is obviously one of those stories that impacts everyone. We will keep you across it as anything changes. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of The Daily Aus. If you learnt something, please send it on to a friend. Don't forget to subscribe or follow us wherever you listen to the podcast, or if you're watching over on our YouTube. We will be back with another one tomorrow, but until then, have a great day.